Just something quick today. We've been working on the bridge over the River Wye, and today we're going to be making the truss rods that hold the trusses together. So this is just a quick look at how you thread small brass wires to use on models this way. It's important to start with the right sized rod. In this case, these small brass rods I got off of Amazon. They're 1.6 millimeters or 1/16 of an inch, slightly large for a 440 thread. But as it's important to put a slight taper on the ends of these rods before you run your cutting die over them, I found I just had to put a little tiny bit more taper to them, and then they cut just fine. So first up, of course, is getting the rods cut to the appropriate length. I've got the trusses already built here, so all I had to do was pass the truss rods down through the construction, figure out how long they needed to be, and then get them cut to the proper length, allowing for the right amount of thread to be at the top and bottom of the rods to thread the nuts and washers on there. I bought the complete tap and die set off of Amazon in a 440 size. It was only $15, very affordable. So I bought the entire set as opposed to just buying the die set, because buying it with the tap was only marginally more money. If you want to get other sizes, the little dies that go in the cutting handle at this point are only a few dollars, so you can get them in larger sizes, smaller sizes, whatever. You'll also need some cutting oil. Nice thing to have on hand anyway, but this is going to be very difficult to do if you don't have some cutting fluid. It's necessary to taper the end of the rod in order to get the die to start easily on their cutting threads. Normally you would turn a nice little camphor on a lathe if you're working in a larger material and a harder material, but with this small brass rod, I found it was easiest to just run it here on my belt sander for a second. And if I put a little too much taper here, that was okay. After I had it threaded, if I had a little nub sticking out there, I just trimmed it off. So now we're ready to actually cut the threads into the rod using the die set. It's important to have your rod mounted in something like a vise, because you're going to be putting a lot of torque on here. And so you need to have it mounted really well. Of course, you also need to be careful to not damage the surface of the rod. That would be unsightly. Now, the cutting die will only fit into the cutting handle one way, and you want to set the cutting handle onto the rod with this recessed side up. If you notice on the actual cutting die, there's some writing on the other side, including an S, which means start. So that's the side that's going to start the threads, and they mount into the cutting handle in such a way that it will only go in with the starting side down if you have the recessed side up like this. The tool should start cutting quite easily. Of course, you want to put a drop of cutting oil on here first, and then as you're cutting down, if it seems to be resisting at all, just back it up a quarter turn or so and then proceed to cut a little bit more. You don't want to just keep cutting and binding it down in there. There's no need for doing that. Just back it up a little and then proceed forward again. If you're having trouble getting it to start, it's probably because the rod is slightly too large. You just need a little more taper on there. If you've got enough taper, you should be able to set the cutting die on the rod and start it quite easily. And then, of course, you just back the tool off once you have enough threads cut on there. And if you want to cut further, it's real easy to set the tool back in place and continue cutting. You can see that there's a little tiny bit of taper there that might look a little unsightly on a finished model, but what I've done is put a lot more thread here than I'm going to need, so that I end up with a threaded section extending out past my nut and washer, and then I just came in with a high-speed cutting wheel and trimmed that off flush with the nut. Looks much better. And at this point, I was able to come in with my nut driver here and tighten these up really quite tight, and it really puts a lot of tension on the truss, and the whole thing actually became much stronger. They're quite functional. Now this is something that you can use for a lot of things other than a truss bridge, truss rods on a passenger car. You might find that you want to do this in a much smaller size for some things. You might want to do it in a much larger size and heavier material, which means that your cutting and everything has to be much more accurate if you're trying to do this in hardened steel on a 1/4-inch rod or something like that. But working here in miniature using brass, it's actually really simple. Well, I thought it would be fun to do a video on just making these truss rods. We'll be following up by finishing the bridge, doing stain and weathering paint and that sort of thing. That will be the next video. And you wanna see that. So if you're not a subscriber to the channel, please subscribe to the channel by clicking on the upcoming blue button. Zoink, right there, the blue button. Well, we're not sure how you found this video on the internet. We hope you didn't find it boring. And Karen and I will see you here on Sunday with some Sunday foolishness. So see you then. Bye-bye.